flat and colorless in every direction. The base had once been military, abandoned when its usefulness had ended, and then quietly repurposed when its usefulness returned in a direct form. Buildings stood in a careful clusters. New wires ran alongside old ones. The desert watched without comment. Matthew drove his family's camper through the gate. It was an unusual choice, but not an unwise one. The camper carried its own magic, as well as being well made, dependable. Inside was a bedroom, bathroom, and a small kitchen, all folded neatly into a space that looked that that understood how to be larger than it appeared. It had been in the family for years, used sparingly, cared for meticulously. It gave him privacy. He parked it alongside the others. He was not the only one who thought of this. Campers and converted trailers lined the edge of the base, each slightly different, each marked with the same instinct: separation without distance, community but on one's own term. Matthew shut the engine and stepped out into the heat. Then, when he saw Professor Byrne, he was not alone. The professor stood with a woman with two children, a boy and a girl, close in height and unmistakably twins. They were watching the activity with the seriousness, attention, who understood that something important was happening, even if they didn't understand what it was. Matthew hesitated, then walked over. Professor. Vern turned to the expression of his softening just slightly. Matthew. He gestured to the woman, my wife, then to his children, and my twins. The boy nodded solemnly. The girl watched Matthew with open curiosity. They will be staying here as if this required no further explanation. Matthew glanced around. The desert, the base, the quiet urgency beneath everything, and nodded. It had been strange kind of sense that mattered enough to bring what you loved closer rather than leave it behind. I brought the camper, said Matthew unnecessary. Vern smiled faintly. So did I. The sun slipped lower, staining the sky with a color that was almost ceremonial. Somewhere nearby, generators hummed, doors opened, voices called out names. Matthew looked at the back of his camper, and then the family standing before him. This was not campus. This was a battlefield. But it would be something else entirely. And it was clear that no one here expected to leave unchanged. Episode 8. The tour began. The next morning, the facility unfolded in layers, each one revealing just enough to feel functional, never enough to feel complete. There was a recreation room first, plain furniture, card tables, shelves of books that have been chosen for durability, then taste. A cafeteria followed, a large and efficient, already marked for the rhythms of shared meals and routine. There was a daycare. Matthew paused longer than he expected to. Children's voices carried down the hall. Laughter, arguments, the unmistakable sound of life continuing without regard for secrecy or consequences. Many of the staff had brought their children with them. It had been encouraged, though no one had said why. Stability, Matthew guessed, or perhaps control. Then it was taken deeper. The library came first. It was large. It was larger than any room that Matthew had seen. Its shelves stretching upward, filled with textbooks or journals, with older volumes, leather, handwritten, some of them damaged, their pages wrapped and darkened. It had survived things that were never meant to explain. Professor Fern stood at the front of the room. These are not theoretical, these are procedural. He gestured to the shelves. Incantations, spells, systems that do not describe power but activate it. The group moved in silence. The laboratory lay behind the library, separated by heavy doors and layers of security that felt deliberate rather than excessive. The room felt the room itself was stark, clean, contained in fields, equipment arranged with careful symmetry. At the center of the lab reinforcement reinforced table. Matthew approached and uncovered what rested there, the sunstone. Matthew recognized it immediately. It looked no different than it had 2 years before, dark, uneven, harmless in appearance, a rock that could be overlooked without effort. This, Vern said, is the same stone you were introduced to in the lecture. He placed his hand on it, not touching it. The library contains incantations required to ignite it. But ignition is not enough. The words and runes must be carved into the heart of the stone itself. Someone shifted uneasily. Precision matters, language matters. Errors do not result in failure, they result in catastrophe. He looked at them in turn. President Frederick has authorized this research. Only he and a small number are aware of the true nature. There will be no correspondence, no acknowledgement, no attribution. The silence in the room thickened. What are we doing here? Professor Vern said. Must be contained not just physically, but conceptually. Matthew stared at the sunstone.